Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. I hope you can see my beautiful play button in the background, which I still have been way too lazy to incorporate in some consistent way on my wall. But here I am, as I promised. This week is back to a somewhat regularly scheduled program, about 2 to 3 streams a week. Hopefully, we'll also have enough Apple news and rumors to actually fill that many streams. CES is over, and unfortunately, it wasn't very exciting to me. We will cover one of the announcements we have already covered before today. There is technically one piece of data that I didn't mention before, and it is in a YouTube video by one of the channels at least I used to like, well, Hardware Canucks. So again, today is definitely more Apple focused than the previous couple of streams, and there is still something from CES to cover. So hopefully you guys are interested. Hopefully you let me know what else you would like to see me cover. As always, while starting out, would like to remind you to do the YouTube jazz. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet done so. Like the video. It helps out tremendously with the algorithm. Share it out to anybody who you think might enjoy it. Help us grow the community here. And please comment. I always say I love interacting with a lively comment section. Love getting your questions, your suggestions, your agreements, your disagreements. So let me know what you think. Let me know what I could and should improve. And if you want to support us directly in the chat, you can do so with a super chat or a super sticker. In fact, shout out to Max Maximus, who already left €2.49, saying we'll check out the stream later at the gym, which is fantastic because right after the stream I'm going to the gym. So I know we don't live close to each other, but hey, we'll be spiritually working out together if this still overlaps, depending on how long the stream is, of course. You can also become a channel member right here on YouTube. Shout out again to Max Maximus, to Steve, and to Angelica, who are all MarkTech Pro Max supporters right here on YouTube. And you can also become a supporter over on Patreon. There are a few different tiers there, including a free one if you want to join that, so you can just have an easier way to contact me. The easiest way still being Twitter or Blue Sky, trying to push as much of my social media engagement from Twitter to Blue Sky as I can. But alas, most of my friends and followers still are on Twitter. It's becoming worse and worse by the day in many ways. So yeah, follow me on Blue Sky. Maybe that will help transition me fully away from X. With all that being said, let's actually get started with the Apple news. We do have actually quite a bit to cover. I know a lot of you are fans of the iPad, which this has been very important to me ever since building this channel, which is that the community here, I know I won't get you to love the iPad in a natural way. Sometimes you guys might like me, but not all of my opinions, right? But with the iPad, it was very important for me to make clear I'm not one of those YouTubers who will constantly be shitting on the iPad unless it somehow someday finally gets macOS. That is just not my goal with the iPad. I acknowledge that the iPad has some shortcomings. Hell, I myself am using obviously a Mac for these live streams. I couldn't do them the same way on my iPad, so I fully understand that there are restrictions in iOS and iPadOS where I believe Apple is just falling short. Even before we consider giving those devices full on macOS, I do believe that iOS and iPadOS should be further in certain things. However, I also believe that iPadOS is by far the best operating system optimized for like a larger multi-touch screen. No Android tablet, no Windows hybrid ever invokes in me the feelings that an iPad does, and I've used those extensively. So I'm very, very excited whenever Apple does something that pushes the iPad legitimately forward, and I do believe that the news that we're going to be covering today are such rumors. They are not revolutionary steps in the iPad's history, but they are steps that will push more very capable iPads into the hands of a lot more people. When we're talking about the M4 iPad Pro, or in the iPad Pro in general. Yes, that's a device that's near and dear to my heart, but I also understand that it's a product that most people probably either won't be able to afford, or they will make a very conscious decision between buying a pretty expensive iPad Pro and something like a MacBook Air, or even like an entry level MacBook Pro. So the iPads that we're discussing today being a lot cheaper, the iPad Air at around $600, and the iPad 11 generation, which should be like around $400-ish. It used to be $450. Currently, the iPad 10th gen is $350. So I assume we will see a price increase from those $350 based on the rumors we're going to discuss. But it's still far, far more accessible to a big amount of people than a $1,000 11-inch iPad Pro, right? Yes, you can consider some of the difference in performance, RAM amount. Well, granted, that RAM difference might be overcome here. The display quality and whatever other like features you might say justify those $1,000 or $1,300. If you look at the 13-inch iPad Pro, it still will not make it as accessible to people as the iPad 10th gen and the 11th gen will be. So let's actually talk about the iPad 11th gen. And as very often happens on this channel, most of the rumors we're covering today come directly from Apple News Jesus himself, Bloomberg's Mark Gurman. I have no idea why I started calling him that, but I'm sticking to it. Doesn't matter. So he has basically been predicting what Apple will launch this year, right? And obviously has been doing so throughout the entirety of last year as well and the year before that. But he is getting a little bit more concrete in his predictions, which is very, very good. This is one of the things that I usually dislike about Mark Gurman, where he doesn't get concrete enough. I know he probably knew for a while when these products are supposed to come out, but probably to protect himself, he would just give like a more general time period, especially for something like the HomePod Mini and stuff like that. I understand that there's probably a lot of variance in when Apple might actually release such a product. Like when you remember when AirTags originally came out, right? They came out like months and months after the products were already packaged and ready to go. So I fully understand why somebody like Mark Gurman, who has a lot riding on having a good reputation, might be a little careful in giving like the exact months and stuff like that. So let's start with the iPad 11th gen. What should we expect, and roughly when should we expect it? Well, for one, he is now getting more concrete on what we should expect inside the iPad 11th generation, and that is the A17 Pro chip. Now, the A17 Pro chip is very interesting here, of course, because it's a first generation 3 nanometer process. It shares that with the M3 family of processors, but otherwise Apple has moved on to M3E, the second generation 3 nanometer process by TSMC, with the M4 family, the A18 chip, the A18 Pro chip. So it seemed to most of us like the A17 Pro and especially the M3 family was kind of doomed, right? To be like, oh, it's in this specific product or in this specific family of products from this year, but then it dies out, right? Like we expected initially maybe there would be like M3 Ultra processors, but it seems like Apple just said, let us move as quickly as possible to the M4. Let us just, TSMC's N3E process has better yields. It is probably cheaper because it has slightly lower transistor density. It still has actual efficiency advantages. It allows higher clock speeds. And our newest CPU and GPU architectures that are inside M4 and A18 have from the ground up been optimized for this node. So let us just do that, right? So, however, it's not like the A17 chip, or in this case, the A17 Pro chip, because Apple never launched an A17 like there is an A18 to the A18 Pro. With the A17 Pro, there is a good question to be asked. did Apple maybe produce enough for the iPhone 15 Pro series, to be exact, so that maybe by the time they stopped producing iPhone 15 Pros, they had enough, especially binned A17 Pro chips left over, so that they can now be utilized for products, including the iPad mini, which launched recently with the A17 Pro chip, but even something even cheaper, like an iPad 11th generation. And it seems like that might be the case. The basic justification that is being given here is that Apple is probably targeting to make iPad 11 compatible with Apple Intelligence features. And by our current understanding, Apple Intelligence basically requires an A17 Pro chip or newer with 8 gigabytes of RAM or more. So the fact that Apple could be using the A17 Pro here is very exciting. Now, I would expect this to be a binned chip, maybe even a heavily binned chip. The iPad mini already features a 5-core GPU version of the A17 Pro rather than the full 6 cores that it has inside the iPhone 15 Pro and 15 Pro Max. Maybe they could go even further, making this a 4-core GPU chip for the iPad 11th generation. Maybe they could do even some CPU binning, because don't forget, there's a huge jump in performance as the iPad 10th generation is built on the A14 chip. So 3 generations older, first generation 5 nanometer node, a chip that originally came out late 2020. It's by no means a bad chip, but especially once you combine it with something like only 4 gigabytes of RAM, it definitely shows its limitation. So there are the discussions here about the chip. For a while, I kind of thought to myself that maybe we could get the A16 inside and Apple would keep Apple Intelligence sort of like reserved for an iPad 12 gen. The reason for that is that the A16 chip is built on the 4 nanometer node, and 4 nanometer node fabs have now gone live in the United States. So Apple has, of course, a strong relationship to TSMC. TSMC, as all Taiwanese companies, is always at the risk of potential attacks by China, as China year after year promises that we will reunite glorious mainland China with Taiwan and all that stuff, right? Rosa joining the chat, hello. But in order to, of course, fight that risk, right, that at some point maybe Taiwan just isn't available the same way it is right now to the West, people have said, well, maybe Apple could shift some of its production of A-series and M-series chips towards the United States. Now, the 3 nanometer node is currently exclusive to Taiwan. 2 nanometers will definitely be exclusive. At the very earliest, if we start like building fabs right now, like 2 nanometer could maybe become available late 2026 in like the first production volume from the US. So that's obviously not good enough for Apple. But if Apple wanted to utilize already existing chips on already existing nodes, A16 would definitely now be a suitable candidate. However, as we've talked about in the past, the A16 chip does not support Apple Intelligence. Now, Apple could make an A16 chip with 8 gigs of RAM. Like, they would have to source different like memory modules, but the A16 already supports 6400 megatransfers per second LPDDR5, the same memory speed as is supported by the A17 Pro chip. So technically, they could just shift some different modules, but I just wouldn't bet on it. Like, Apple doesn't like doing that too much, like combining older parts with like some newer components. Plus, there are definitely some shortcomings in the A16 when it comes to like raw AI capability. The neural engine in the A17 Pro is quite a bit better, especially at integer computations. And there's also the question about efficiency. There might not be a super huge uplift between the 4 nanometer node that the A16 is based on and the 3 nanometer node that the A17 Pro Pro is based on, but it's probably still enough for Apple to just generally claim, you know what, Apple Intelligence, A17 chips, M1 chips or newer, right? No, obviously no Intel chips, but also like no chips older than A17. So while it would be an interesting experiment for Apple to make an A16 iPad 11th generation, that would either mean leaving Apple Intelligence entirely off the product, giving like maybe a gimped version of Apple Intelligence to it, which would be very weird and very hard to market, or combining the A16 chip with like 8 gigs of RAM for the first time, seeing how that works out, whether or not like the A&E shortcomings versus the A17 and the efficiency, like the lesser efficiency comes back to bite you. It seems like it just makes sense to utilize whatever A17 Pro chips are out there. I, in fact, wouldn't even be surprised if we saw the removal of the Pro moniker from the A17 Pro branding, because maybe Apple just says, you know what? Maybe this device doesn't have USB 3 speeds, right? It might still be like a USB 2 speed device. We might utilize chips where like that USB controller is in some way limited or whatever, right? Of course, I would prefer it to be an A17 Pro, right? But Apple already gatekeeps certain features, even just based on software. Like it's not like every iPad with an A17 Pro chip got the latest HDR pipeline from the iPhones. Yes, I know the iPads also use much older cameras and much older sensors, but technically you could still at least greatly boost image quality thanks to the A17 Pro. But Apple does not really do that kind of stuff. So my expectation is we're looking at a heavily binned, potentially A17 chip, maybe with like an efficiency or core or two disabled, maybe with 2 GPU cores disabled rather than 1, as we've seen on the iPad mini. So stuff like that, something that is very likely to like have happened to A17 Pro chips in production, right? Imperfect yields, some mistakes in production, but still utilizable chips. Maybe cutting off some features like USB 3 transfer speeds to the USB-C port, but in general still being a high quality chip, reaching almost 3,000 points in single core in Geekbench, over 7,500 points in multi-core, maybe, unless there is some CPU binning going on. So plenty of power, especially given that we're comparing it currently to a product with the A14 chip. So let us actually go to Geekbench. I know Geekbench doesn't solve for everything, but it's still a pretty good like shorthand for what a device is capable of doing, how it roughly compares to other products that are built on similar architectures. So let us look at, wait, can I not? There it is, iOS. So in single core performance, you will see, by the way, those A18 Pro benchmarks, they're pretty low. You can find a lot around the 3600 range, and the M4 you can find around the 3700, 3800 range. And then obviously on the Max side, the M4 Pro, M4 Max, this is where you can hit 4000. But yeah, looking at the A14 chip here, which is where currently the iPad 10th gen is at, that's 2,100 points, maybe 2,200 if you're lucky, but usually that's not the case. So here, A17 Pro, 2,900. Almost 3,000. Depends a little bit on the version of iOS you're running. Yeah, definitely some very nice uplift. It's not like the A16 would be that far behind, like roughly 10% versus the A17 Pro. But again, there are differences in how it doesn't support hardware accelerated ray tracing, how it wasn't really designed for 8 gigs of RAM, how it has a slower Apple neural engine. So all that stuff probably goes a long way for Apple to just say, let us use whatever A17 chips are utilizable. Maybe we even just cut away the Pro branding and see how that goes, right? So that is very interesting. This iPad supposedly is coming alongside a redesigned iPad Air, or an iPad Air with a redesigned Magic Keyboard, I should say specifically. A new iPhone SE, which might be called iPhone 16e. Again, I still have not heard good explanations of why it should be called that, but nor have I seen very reputable sources claim that. Only one guy on Twitter. So yeah, for now I'm holding off and just calling it the next gen iPhone SE. And this is supposedly coming in the spring, so like a March, April thing. We've had people claim that maybe the iPhone SE could launch as early as this January, but that was then debunked by Mark Gurman. So seemingly Apple is collecting up quite a few products to launch simultaneously sometime this spring. My hope it's going to be sometime in March because that's where I have some time. Then in April, early April, I have no time at all, unfortunately. And it so happens that here it looks like it might be a full-on event. It might be what we have seen with the M4 Mac family, where Apple just day after day keeps launching new products on their website. Not sure what the exact plan is going to be this time around. Regardless, hopefully if it happens in March, I'll be there with you guys to react to it. If it happens in April, I might be like a week or two late on the coverage. So please forgive me if that's what ends up happening. But that was the cheaper iPad that we're gonna see this spring. Obviously, we know about the M4 MacBook Air. There's pretty much no surprises there. Like, I mean, we just got the M4 MacBook Pro, so the M4 MacBook Air will be that, but worse in certain ways. When it comes to the iPad Air that we're seeing this spring, for a long time we expected it to have an M3 processor inside, and the logic behind it was actually quite similar to why we expected maybe the iPad 11 generation to come with like an A16 chip, for example, rather than something more ambitious and more expensive like an A17 Pro. And the reason is, for one, there is the problem with the first generation 3nm node, right? That Apple basically stopped production on most of this, has moved on to N3E, is utilizing there the better efficiency, the better yields, the cheaper production, all that stuff, right? However, using M3 might have had the same advantages as using the A17 Pro that I just laid out, right? Which is that if Apple maybe overproduced M3 chips for the M3 Max, right, maybe some of those chips are utilizable for an iPad Air. The iPad Air already uses like bint processors. The M2 chip inside the current iPad Air does not have its full GPU enabled. So that would line up pretty well with the M3 coming in, 10-core GPU processor, been down to 9, maybe even 8 cores, depending on just how aggressive Apple wants to be here. But then utilizing its hardware accelerated ray tracing, its faster neural engine, right? All that stuff. But it seems like Apple might be going a little bit further and launching, instead of an M3 based iPad Air, an M4 based iPad Air. And of course, the M4 chip is already in the iPad Pro. So it's not like it's entirely crazy. There were times in history basically where iPad Air and iPad Pro chips almost overlapped and stuff like that. Obviously, Apple can use a far more binned down a far more binned down M4 chip in the iPad Air than they do inside the iPad Pro. In fact, the M4 in the iPad Pro is actually having some pretty unique binning by Apple standards, where Apple only bins the CPU rather than the GPU. So all M4 iPad Pros, let me find it first. So all M4 iPad Pros come with the full 10-core GPU, but they vary between a 10-core CPU and a 9-core CPU, right? Let me find that. So a 9-core CPU version with 3 performance cores and 6 efficiency cores. And there's a 10-core CPU version with 4 performance cores and 6 efficiency cores. So whenever Apple has an M4 chip where one CPU core might not work as they want it to, so they will just give it to the 256 and 512 gigabyte versions of the M4 iPad Pro. And whenever they have fully enabled M4 chips, they will give it to some of their Macs or their 1 terabyte or 2 terabyte iPad Pros. Apple could also maybe like make a little bit of a cut and say like, you know what, we're actually cutting the binned M4 from the iPad Pro. So all iPad Pros in the future come with the fully enabled M4 chip, 10 GPU cores, 10 CPU cores. But all the bin chips, they now go to the iPad Air and the MacBook Air, right? So that could be a way to even like almost, it wouldn't be a year after launch, but 10 months after launch, they could add some extra value to the lower tier iPad Pros without drastically changing the product. Now, it should be said that the sales through for the M4 iPad Pro is not terribly high. It seems like for a lot of things, people like are happy with the 11-inch version, so the 13-inch version might be a little underwhelming in sales. So I'm just here speculating how Apple could add maybe a little bit of value to a product that might need a little bit of a boost here. Also, 8 gigs of RAM. The iPad Pro is currently the only M4-based product with 8 gigs of RAM. Maybe that changes. Maybe Apple makes 16 gigs of RAM standard on the iPad Pro the way they have done on the MacBooks. It's hard to say. I hope they do, but this part is completely speculation on my side. Two idiot NRIAs. Hi, Mark. How would you feel about the iPad 11 for my sister to take over shorts duty for a fledgling YouTube channel? I do main videos on Final Cut Pro on my MacBook Pro. Shorts. The issue is if you go to this channel, you'll find that it has exactly 2 shorts. But you mean like just recording them like with the front camera and maybe editing them with something like LumaFusion or even just iMovie, right? Because, well, I actually, let me check one thing out, right? Final Cut Pro, iPad Mini, or it's just Final Cut for iPad, but so Final Cut for iPad. Does it say which iPad it's compatible with? I always forget if the iPad Mini with its A17 Pro chip supports Final Cut. So I know obviously the A14 chip. Jesus Christ, how difficult is it? Welches iPad here? Or iPad Air. No, it does not. Damn, it does not support the iPad Mini. Jesus Christ, Apple, what are you doing? But they might not support the iPad Mini because the iPad Mini is like, because the iPad Mini has too small of a screen, so maybe it would end up with way too cramped of an app. But I mean, LumaFusion, iMovie definitely work, and they will definitely see a performance uplift. I get it. I hate shorts. Seems YouTube wants them. Yeah, and I'll definitely be looking into making shorts now because with TikTok being banned in the United States, I mean, there will be a little bit of a gold rush on shorts on YouTube for sure, right? I know some people claim that they're switching to this weird Chinese app called Red Book or whatever, but I just don't see that happening. I mean, Europe is sticking with TikTok for now, so I just don't really see the potential for like specifically the American TikTok audience switching to another Chinese app rather than YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, or whatever, or Snapchat Reels. I always forget which app is what. Right. So yeah, but I fully understand YouTube might be YouTube Shorts might just be necessary. I just mean editing them on CapCut, etc. Let me briefly look CapCut. CapCut. I actually didn't know that CapCut had an iPad app. Okay, yeah, I mean that 11th gen iPad, yeah, will definitely work for it. I mean, if it's supported on iPhone and iPad, uh, so the A17 Pro definitely will be a nice power device for this. 8 gigs of RAM for shorts is plenty. I mean, unless you are using like pro raw footage or something like that, or like red magic, like red raw or whatever, which I doubt. And if you have your Mac for Final Cut editing anyway, yeah, I actually think this would be a killer product for that. I mean, the A17 Pro in multi-core, right? Let me actually go back to benchmarks, right? The So the M1 chip gives around 8,400. The A17 Pro gives around 7,500. These results are outdated. These results are based on older benchmarks. So it has more single core performance than the M1, has a newer neural engine than the M1, newer media encoders, though they aren't changed drastically, admittedly, between M1 and M3 or A14 and A17. But yeah, I think you'll be able to do quite a lot here, because when I look at how good my M1 iPad even is for some basic editing, for more advanced ones, I would have my MacBook as well with Final Cut. But yeah, I honestly think that would be a good purchase, especially if you really feel the need to save a bit of money. Like, I guess the iPad Air could also do a lot of that stuff. So maybe you could consider like a discounted M2 iPad Air, which at that point will be faster in a lot of ways, right? Around 10,000 point in multi-core, a lot faster GPU thanks to it having like double the bus width. In single core performance, it will actually be inferior, but it won't be too far behind, 2,600 points rather than 2,900 points, right? And depending on how it's bent and how much cooling Apple gives the chip, the M2 might be realistically faster in most workflows. Plus, Apple is a little bit more generous with features when it comes to M series devices, like especially stuff like Stage Manager is unfortunately just seemingly not coming to A series products. But yeah, it seems like if you really want like the most capable iPad, you would get one with an M series chip. But if you know that you wouldn't even really utilize most of that, then yeah, I do believe that the iPad 11th generation, especially if you can get it still with a nice discount over like an M2 iPad Air, for example, I do believe it's going to be a worthwhile purchase. So yeah, hopefully that helped. Let's actually go back to the M4 iPad Air. So here, this is again coming from Bloomberg's Mark Gurman. It would continue basically the 11 and 13-inch sizes of the M2 iPad Air. So this is actually one of the things why people were confused originally with why we need a new iPad Air. Because the last iPad Air only came out last May, so alongside the M4 iPad Pro. But seemingly Apple decided that maybe a new Magic Keyboard warrants like a proper next gen. Maybe having the M2 iPad Air just seemed too old for most people, with the M4 iPad Pro seeming a lot newer, a lot more capable, having like the very advertisable tandem OLED screen with ProMotion, increased efficiency, all that jazz. So maybe Apple wants to introduce it with the M4 chip, just so it has like fewer disadvantages versus the iPad Pro. Not because Apple wants to sell fewer iPad Pros, but because at some point it just doesn't make sense to make iPad Airs if they just motivate people to buy iPad Pros. So Apple still wants sales on their mid tier products, and maybe the M2 iPad Pro, iPad Air just wasn't enough. My other speculation is that they actually plan to launch the M2 iPad Air a lot earlier than May of last year, but they delayed it so it could coincide with the M4 iPad Pro rather than making it coexist with the M2 iPad Pro that had been already on the market for a while. So, and maybe Apple just sees, oh, you know what? This time around, we can actually overlap like the chips that are being used on the iPad Air and the iPad Pro, because the iPad Pro has now this super duper huge screen advantage with tandem OLED. It has this super thin design, right? And maybe we just update the iPad Air with a newer chip, give it the ability to connect to the same Magic Keyboard as the iPad Air, as the M4 iPad Pro. Maybe it won't be as perfect of a fit because one is thicker than the other, but hell, if they keep it around 6 millimeters, I'm pretty sure that it could still fit inside the Magic Keyboard that is designed for the 11 and 13-inch iPad Pros, which of course are 5.3 and 5.1 millimeters thick respectively. So while percentage-wise, there is a big thickness difference, but when you look at the overall Magic Keyboard, probably 1 millimeter more or less won't matter too much. So that would be my speculation on what they're planning to do with the Magic Keyboard. Having different Magic Keyboards between this iPad Air and the current M4 iPad Pro, in my opinion, would be quite disastrous and very confusing, would be also bad for Apple's logistics. So I hope they somehow make them compatible. When we actually go to the iPad accessories here, let me close this. Let me close this. So, and we look at iPad accessories. So the Magic Keyboard obviously is exclusive here for the M4 iPad Pro. And when we look at the Magic Keyboard for the 11-inch iPad Air, wait, is that not also compatible with other? Yeah, so you can see that one Magic Keyboard is compatible with all these different 11-inch iPads. So I hope they make the same thing true just with the new Magic Keyboard, right? Yes, there is more of a thickness difference these days between iPad Pros and Airs, where ironically the iPad Pro is thinner than the iPad Air. This, by the way, is why I was always apprehensive about Apple making the iPad Pro so thin. I actually don't mind the weight decrease. I think that's a smart choice. But when it comes to the thickness reduction, I just think it just unnecessarily invites like compatibility issues. It can result in durability problems. But yeah, and when you look at the iPad Air, when you look at the Magic Keyboard design for the iPad Air 13-inch, and you look at the compatibility list here, you'll find it has also includes a few iPad Pros here as well. So hopefully they can pull the same thing off for the Magic Keyboard as it currently exists for the iPad Pro, because if you go here, right, you'll find compatibility list only the M4 iPad Pro. So, according to Bloomberg's Mark Gurman from his Power On newsletter, the new iPad Air's code named J607, J608, J637, and J638. This is basically the different sizes plus 5G version versus Wi-Fi only option. So two sizes, two configurations when it comes to cellular or not. Don't get confused why technically one iPad needs 4 code names. It will be more about specification upgrades than design changes. The current version introduced last year has the M2 chip. I wouldn't be terribly surprised if the 2025 models get bumped up to the M4, matching the iPad Pro. That would mean the Pro has less of an edge over the Air, but that shouldn't be too shocking. most Macs rely on the same chip family, and iPads could do the same. I absolutely agree. And even right now, when you look at it, right, we do have currently the M3 MacBook Air, which will soon be upgraded to the M4 MacBook Air, coexisting with the M4 MacBook Pros, right? The iPad Air is similar in that regard, but it is then a generation more behind, right? It has the M2 chip and coexists with the M4 iPad Pro family, while the Macs are more closely aligned. You can still buy an M2 MacBook Air for a little bit less money than the M3 version, but that's an optional choice. It's not like the only option that Apple leaves you in the market. So maybe over time, Apple makes the iPad family as big as the MacBook family, and we'll have like multiple generations of processors to choose from and stuff like that. But for now, seems like it might just make sense to give this a nice boost from M2 to M4, and at that point you can conceivably keep it in the lineup for like 2 years or even more without really changing it, if that's what you really want to do, because this is not a chip that will age quickly. Like seemingly the M5 chip will be N3P, so my hopes of a 2 nanometer processor from Apple this year are kind of dwindling, unfortunately. So that would make it all the way until the M6 chip, until there's like a significant difference from the M4, especially for like an iPad Air that wouldn't even get like the fully enabled chip. So if maybe even the M5 greatly boosts GPU performance over the M4 and M3, that still wouldn't mean too much for the iPad Air, where I doubt Apple would give it all the cooling capability to even take advantage of that. It doesn't have a ProMotion screen, so it could run games at 120 hertz. So I think M4, bin down chip, a few GPU cores disabled, a few CPU cores disabled maybe, will do just fine, in my opinion. Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. Also, the iPad Air, some other, well, we don't know exactly about the iPad Air, but seemingly Apple is looking to introduce their custom 5G modems this year and their Wi-Fi modems, but seemingly Wi-Fi is not really in the cards, at least for like right now in the spring. But no design changes are expected for the next gen iPad Air, but it could include Apple's upcoming custom 5G modem, which will be introduced in the iPhone SE, the low-cost iPad, which I assume would just mean the 11th gen iPad, and the iPhone 17 Air. So seemingly Apple could make a big spring thing out of like their own modem and say, look, it's very efficiency focused. For them, it saves a little bit of money. When actually, how much does Apple charge on the iPad Air to add 5G? It's still $150, right? So 11-inch version, space gray, 128 gigs. Yeah, it's $150 to add 5G on the iPad Air. And on the base iPad, I believe it's 100. Blue, 64 gigs. No, it's actually $150. So maybe it could be a way for Apple to drop the price of this cellular upgrade. I mean, it's already a bit too expensive, to be honest. But Apple does like their margins, and whenever they make optional hardware upgrades that the majority of customers won't even use, that's where they definitely like to make their margins. But there is the added complication that Qualcomm, with their current licensing agreement, basically doesn't just get a flat sum every year from Apple with their patent sharing agreement, but I believe they also get a small sum for every product that features one of their modems. And I don't mean for buying the modems, because obviously that's only fair, but I mean like per device, and I believe relative to the cost of the device. I think I should look in whether or not it has ever leaked, or if there are some court documents saying exactly how much Qualcomm charges in that way. But maybe going for their own 5G modems here could bring this down to maybe 469, maybe 449, which I believe will definitely make it a lot more attractive, because $150 might not be that much for the iPad Pro, and it is a decent amount for the iPad Air, but it's a horrendous sum to add upon a product that starts at 349. You're almost adding like half the cost just to add cellular. At that point, you will really, really consider, oh my God, maybe I'm better off getting more storage or something like that. And then a lot of people just hit like certain price barriers, because you might not want to pay that much more than $500 for your new tablet, especially if you then still need to pay like a bit for the Apple Pencil if you want one. A Magic Keyboard Folio is not cheap. You probably are better off getting some kind of other keyboard case, or maybe like connecting it to a Bluetooth keyboard instead. So yeah, definitely if Apple could find a way to lower that price increase, that would go a long way to making 5G iPads a lot more reasonably priced in the eyes of consumers. And looking at the iPad Pro, I believe that upcharge is actually $200, right? Space Black, 256, standard glass. Yeah, it's $200 upcharge on the iPad Pro. Now, it will take a while, seemingly, for Apple to introduce a proper next-gen 5G modem that can actually like fully keep up with what Qualcomm is offering. So at that point, I would assume the iPad Pro probably sticks with Qualcomm modems for a while, but maybe sometime next year. This is when we are rumored to get Apple's second generation 5G modems. Maybe then in combinations with Apple's more advanced Wi-Fi 7 Wi-Fi modems, it could be basically a restart for Apple in how they utilize like wireless connectivity inside their products. Because currently their Wi-Fi modems come from Broadcom, their 5G modems come from Qualcomm. So maybe that would be the end of it. Let's see. Speaking of products that are going to be utilizing Apple's Wi-Fi modems, after mentioning products that could be utilizing Apple's 5G modem, let's talk about some smaller, more accessory-like products inside the Apple family that are supposedly still coming out this year. Of course, we have talked on this channel about the so-called HomePad, like a proper HomePod with like an iPad like screen connected to it, so you can control like your smart home appliances. Seemingly, this is again coming from Bloomberg's Mark Gurman. We're also seeing a new HomePod Mini and Apple TV releasing this year. Apple TV being very interesting here because Apple TV is currently based on the A15 processor. So it actually, in some ways, well, it's a very heavily bin down processor. It is technically a newer chip than what's inside the iPad 10th generation, right? So at that point, my question is, will Apple include like a bin down A18 chip or something like that inside the Apple TV? That would be very, very fascinating for a product that is less than $200 in price. But we'll have to see. Obviously, the Apple TV is also currently only equipped with 4 gigs of RAM, so it will be interesting to see if Apple gives it like the full 8 gigabytes, maybe makes it Apple Intelligence compatible. But yeah, it will be very interesting to see. But we have had obviously reports on these two products being updated this year. So what is new now from Mark Gurman, which I have already like praised him for today, is that we now get a more precise time frame. Previously, it was towards the end of the year. Now it's seemingly we'll see a release between September and November. So and like Well, it should be noted he still says towards the end of the year. So this is why actually in my description of this video I did put it as like end of the year. But yeah, I don't think Apple is launching it in December, and anything before September is not really end of the year. So it could be like an October event where, or a November event where Apple introduces maybe like M5 Max, and then alongside it like some of these accessories. Maybe they wouldn't even be part of an event, they would just be like updated on Apple's website. But this is the state where we're at right now. Supposedly these two products would be part of a broader push by Apple into the home space, right? I mean, they already have HomePod Mini, HomePod, the Apple TV, but obviously whenever you refresh your products, you create new opportunities to market them, and then you combine them with actual new products, like new product categories inside your portfolio. In this case, we're talking like the all-new Home Hub, which again, we lovingly sort of dubbed the HomePad, and potentially a Face ID doorbell and lock, and a security camera. So some of those things might be coming like late this year, like the HomePad, and then some other parts would be followed early next year, like with the doorbell and lock, the security camera. Depends to be seen if it's actually like in-house Apple designed products, or maybe Apple partners with somebody else. Definitely like home pods and Apple TVs seem very Apple-like. But granted, before the launch of AirTag, I kind of would have bet that Apple wouldn't really make AirTags themselves, like tracking devices, but would rather cooperate with some third party. But maybe they're just like, they're going to utilize their like reputation for focus on privacy and security to push out like safe home products, right? Smart home products that like respect your privacy, are very secure, very integrated in the Apple ecosystem, still give you the full Apple Store experience, right? You get into the store, you can get it repaired by an Apple genius, you can get help through the Apple support app, all that stuff. Maybe Apple just sees a big advantage in combining all of that together and making sure their ecosystem grows a little bit, because that's also something that like analysts probably are really looking into. With like Vision Pro having come out, yes, it expands the Apple ecosystem, but it doesn't generate too much revenue, for example. Does Apple have new products for the ecosystem overall, right? Not every single product has to be an iPhone level success, but maybe these products become more successful than originally predicted, and then analysts can claim, you know what, Apple opened up a new market for themselves. It's maybe like 0.1% of their overall revenue, but hey, 0.1% on top of hundreds of billions of dollars is not bad, right? So let's see how that plays out. Supposedly, these products would be equipped with Apple's own Wi-Fi and Bluetooth chips, so that would make sure that privacy, security is baked in on a hardware level. It also, of course, would allow Apple to save money. It would allow them to create a large logistics chain around these Wi-Fi and Bluetooth chips. So supposedly they're built on around Wi-Fi 6E, so seemingly those are slightly older chips right now, as Apple is finalizing their Wi-Fi 7 Wi-Fi modems. But it's good enough for something like the 11th gen iPad and even like the iPad Air, and of course these much cheaper products like the HomePod Mini, which currently only, by the way, supports Wi-Fi 4, and the current Apple TV supports Wi-Fi 6. So at the very least, it's an improvement for these products. Would add the 6 gigahertz band. I assume it would be like Bluetooth 5, while maybe Apple is already working on Bluetooth 6 compatibility for their like better Wi-Fi chips, combining Wi-Fi and Bluetooth together, Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 6 at that point. So Apple could really say that this is the most advanced Wi-Fi modem ever in a product. So maybe by the time they integrate such a modem inside like the iPhone um, 18 Pro or whatever, it would just be so superior to any Broadcom modem they have ever used before that it's actually very advertisable. It's not like Broadcom is standing still, by the way. Obviously, Wi-Fi 7 already exists, and I mean, Wi-Fi 7 is even already inside the latest iPhones, but it's just not really made faster than Wi-Fi 6E. So Apple didn't really improve top download speeds on their on the Wi-Fi 7 modems they bought versus the Wi-Fi 6E modems they already had. So my assumption is that these Wi-Fi 6E modems will probably match the same 2.4 gigabits per second that we already have, which again would be a big update over the Apple TV currently with its half-speed Wi-Fi 6 chip. A huge monumentous upgrade over the Wi-Fi 4 specification inside the HomePods. It would be also an improvement over Wi-Fi 6 on the 10th gen iPad, and it would roughly be in line with the Wi-Fi 6E modem that is already built into the M2 iPad Air. So again, some side steps for certain products, some improvements, some small improvements for other products, and some giant improvements for other products. Let's see how that ultimately plays out. So of course, other potential changes coming to the next Apple TV include a newer A series chip that is pretty much a given. Apple basically always update the A series chip. Whether or not that means Apple will want to make it Apple Intelligence compliant and give it like an A17 or an A18 chip remains to be seen. They could just give it an A16 if they really wanted to. I already pointed out how the A16 is being manufactured in the United States. So maybe just to appease the US government, especially the more nationalistic Trump administration, maybe Apple will just have to find some way to integrate A16 processors. It's a bit of a shame that we are like at 4 nanometers in the United States, because 4 nanometer to 3 nanometer for Apple is just this huge cutoff with Apple Intelligence support and stuff like that, the newer neural engine inside the 3 nanometer devices. It just is a bit of a shame that the one chip that can be realistically produced in the United States is not as cheap as even like an A15 or an A14 would be, but it's not as new as an A17 or an 18 would be. So yeah, it's a little bit questionable what Apple can do here. One thing that benefits them, that benefits their consumers, but also one that kind of like gives them a better relationship with the incoming US administration. So that will be quite fun to see. And yeah, with the HomePod Mini, it's currently based on the S5 chip that came inside the Apple Watch Series 5. So definitely in need of an upgrade here. Now, whether or not that means it could get something like the A16, I have no idea. If we are looking at something that realistically is only there, maybe Siri still keeps working entirely online, right? I don't even know what chip Apple would have realistically right now. Like, I assume they would just utilize another Apple Watch processor. And speaking of Apple Watch, that brings us actually to the last big news or rumors about Apple that we're covering today. This is also coming from Bloomberg's Mark Gurman, so thank you to him for feeding us well today. And that is that we are supposedly seeing a new Apple Watch SE, which at this point would be the Apple Watch SE 3 this year. And obviously it's coming later this year. Apple Watches do come out like a month or so around the iPhone, so it's not a surprise that it might be a September or October announcement. And it will have a new look of some kind, so very little specifying here, unfortunately. This is where some old rumors come in about questions whether or not Apple might switch the Apple Watch SE to a plastic body to make sure that they can keep a relatively low price, or maybe even lower down the price from the current $250. That's because the Apple Watch SE is primarily aimed at kids. So, and the Apple Watch used market is actually pretty competitive. So, with of course regular Apple Watches having even more features than the Apple Watch SE. So maybe Apple sees a need to keep Apple Watch SE prices as low as possible, because at some point it just wouldn't make sense to keep producing them if people just keep buying like refurbished, discounted, already used like regular Apple Watches, right, with nicer materials and everything. And maybe maybe with inflation, Apple will have to increase the pricing of the regular Apple Watch, maybe from the current $400 to $450 or something like that. So whatever they can do to either keep the same $249, maybe bring it down a little bit to something like $220, maybe that material choice could make that happen. It should be noted that switching to a cheaper material is not always necessarily a guarantee for making something actually cheaper. Part of that goes with with just the understanding Apple has an already established logistical supply chain for like their aluminum cases on the Apple Watch, right? So there is a big mass market, like mass production discount for Apple in utilizing the same materials and basically almost the same designs as the regular Apple Watches. They can like reuse basically things that then get too outdated for the regular Apple Watch. The same screens, the same chassis, right? And the other thing is, if they make it dramatically less durable, right, and they have like more warranty cases that they need to service, because yes, contrary to some beliefs, Apple does service it when their products break. It might not give them the best like reputation. It could cost them more money in that case. So while I do believe that they at some point definitely have considered a plastic casing, whether or not it actually comes true remains to be seen. Maybe they'll just integrate a newer generation screen inside the Apple Watch, slim down the bezels a little bit. The current ones are very reminiscent of like the Apple Watch Series 4 and Series 5. So maybe they could make it more in line with like the Series 6 and Series 7. Again, no, I believe Series 6 get an update in bezel size? I actually think not. I think it was the Series 7 only. I think the Series 6 gave you a larger screen, but not. Let me actually look. Apple Watch Series 5 versus Series 6. I think the Series 6 biggest change was the screen. Help me decide between Series 5 and Series 6. Okay, people are asking for the prices. Buyer's guide. Okay, so the Series 6 did not change the design. S6 processor, U1 ultra wide chip, blood oxygen monitoring, 40 or 44 millimeter case, difference, brighter display. Okay, yeah, so Series 7. Granted, updating the Apple Watch SE to like a Series 7 screen would be potentially a problem, because the Series 7 bezels are very, very thin. It's a more expensive screen to produce. So maybe Apple could find some other design changes to implement. But yeah, that will be very interesting to find out. So this is all the Mark Gurman stuff for today. Everything from the iPad 11th generation, supposedly coming with an A17 Pro chip, the next gen iPad Air jumping from the M2 all the way up to the M4 chip, an Apple Watch SE with some kind of redesign coming later this year, whether or not that means a plastic casing or some other design changes. And HomePod Mini 2 and the next generation Apple TV also coming at the end of the year and being one of those products that are going to be utilizing Apple's in-house Wi-Fi and Bluetooth modems. So alongside actually that iPad 11th Gen and iPad Air that we have already mentioned. So it will be interesting to see, because obviously if like the iPad Air and the iPad 11th generation come out and they don't have like these new modems, be it 5G or Wi-Fi or whatever, right, that will like negatively taint some of the other rumors about Apple's modems. So I'm actually not even quite sure which exact modems are being predicted for like the iPad Air at this point. Some have only said 5G. Some have said Wi-Fi and 5G modems. So for now, I'm really covering those modems pretty much separately from the products where they might actually show up, because some of it is a little bit unclear. Like for example, for the iPhone SE, right? The iPhone SE is like supposedly coming with like the new 5G modem, but I'm not sure whether or not it's coming with the new Wi-Fi modems. So I'll just try to give you the individual pieces, and whatever puzzle they create in the end, we'll explore that together when the time comes. If you have maybe read some better leaks and rumors where it's more precisely defined which device gets which modem when, I mean, we covered that once. Maybe there's been more to that since then. Please let me know. Let me know in the comments. Let me know live, however you want to. And then I'll look into it, so I'll be a little bit more confident in how I cover these specific leaks and rumors. Now, there's one piece of news, and it goes alongside the long-term promise that I've given on this channel, which probably will start coming into fruition either later this week or sometime next week, and that is that I'll finally start aggregating benchmarks for the A18 and M4 family of chips. Probably do it in a very basic way for now, and then I'll start accumulating. The problem is I had hoped that at this point in time we would have like more native games on Android, right? Like the likes of Resident Evil and Assassin's Creed and now Sniper Elite, right? All these games that have recently been coming out on iPhone and iPad. And my biggest disappointment has been that the Android community seems to be weirdly proud of saying, you know what, you can use a PC emulator on on these devices. And for one, it does not support DX12 games, which is already a huge problem. Second, frame time consistency is often a mess. Even if you can reach relatively high frame rates, the actual frame pacing can be terrible. Third, you'll have to deal with, obviously, the overhead. But fourth, you'll also have to deal with very, very large install sizes, which, like, yeah, you can argue, oh, at that point, you can maybe utilize higher quality textures on, like, Resident Evil than the iPhone version has. But that's the iPhone version. You're playing it on a small screen. You're fine with having lower quality textures for having 4 times more space on your device. So yeah, it's a little bit of a mess. I had hoped that maybe we could have some real head-to-head comparisons here where Android really like picks up the AAA ball, doesn't seem to be happening right now. Maybe it will happen after an exclusivity period with Apple runs out, but that also begs the question of whether or not the Android market really has any sustainability for like games that cost 20, 30, 40, 50 dollars, potentially like full price 60 or 70 dollar titles. So it seems like for now I'll just be in like the Geekbench and Cinebench territory. And speaking of Cinebench, let's talk about the Ryzen AI Max processors and how they compare to the Apple M4 family of chips.
And while it might be a naming nightmare, like the Ryzen AI Max Plus 395, for example.
And it will include a Pro if it's like a business product.
I don't understand why AMD is just going this route. Doesn't make any sense, but look, it's something special. It has a huge 16-thread, 32-core processor paired with a massive GPU core, all in one package, and it's being crammed into...
It should be noted, one package literally means one package. It's not one die, the same way the M4 chips are up to the Max family. Apple uses an interconnect once they reach the Ultra family of chips, which currently, right now, unfortunately, is only M1 Ultra and M2 Ultra. We never got an M3 Ultra, and we haven't yet gotten an M4 Ultra. So this is a system on a chip, but it consists of 3 dies. 2 CPU chiplets with 8, well, the maximum version does, with 8 Zen 5 cores each, and then the massive GPU die, massive relatively by APU standards on the PC side, with up to 40 GPU cores, and obviously all the I/O controls and stuff like that.
Ultra small.
And seemingly all of it is manufactured on 4 nanometer.
But absolutely incredible things like this ROG Flow Z13 tablet. Basically, the intent here is to offer what almost seemed impossible for Windows devices, and that's to beat Apple's M4 series chips.
That's not really the goal. I mean, the goal is to offer something that is at least akin to Apple, to the benefits that Apple Silicon provides. I mean, the M4 family of chips is built on a 2nd generation 3 nanometer node. It's built on ARM CPUs, which in general usually are more efficient than x86 CPUs. So while I'm not saying it's entirely impossible for the Ryzen AI Max to like defeat the M4 Max chip, and I am really comparing it to the M4 Max chip, especially when we're talking about the Ryzen AI Max Plus 395, which matches the M4 Max in a lot of ways, like 16 CPU cores, the M4 Max having 12 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores, 40 GPU compute units. The one thing where it falls woefully short is its memory bus, which is 256-bit wide, while on the MacBook it's 512 bits. And it actually uses slightly faster 8533 memory versus 8000 megatransfers per second LPDDR5X memory on the Ryzen AI Max chip. So yeah, the M4 Max has more than double the bandwidth, and even the M4 Pro actually has a little bit more bandwidth than the Ryzen AI Max Plus 395.
Most workloads, while also giving gamers something cool to play around with. And according to AMD's own numbers, that's exactly what the AI Max Plus.
So we've already covered this chart, so this is not the chart that we are comparing here. Nicely enough, at least we're seeing Cinebench 24 being used here. This is not the result that I want to cover today. So you can see this is a multi-threaded Cinebench test, and you can see that the M4 Pro 12 core, this is 8 performance and 4 efficiency cores, comes with basically at 1x, and then the Ryzen AI Max Plus with its 16 desktop Zen 5 cores has 12% more performance. But then the M4 Pro 14 core does have even more power. This obviously consists out of 10 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. Ironically, they did not use the M4 Max here, which obviously goes all the way up to 16 cores. which would be way more comparable here. It would still probably consume way less power. And then the other benchmarks, I still have no idea whether they use CPU or GPU for it. I mean, they did put like Cinebench on the same page here, so I am assuming all of this is CPU. And then with V-Ray, I'm just assuming this is either an app that isn't very Mac optimized, or maybe they use the GPU here for once. Yeah, so this stuff does not interest me too much. It's not something I can that easily verify. Plus, whenever it comes to actually potentially utilizing the GPU, I just think that having the 40-core GPU compute here is just completely stupid to compare it with a chip that goes up only, quote-unquote, to 20 GPU compute units.
395
But that's
at least
not the
can do
result
in
we are
heavy
actually
multi-threaded
looking
workloads.
to cover today
Of course,
here.
take these with a grain of salt, but as we all know by now, in laptops, power consumption means everything. And these numbers wouldn't be worth anything if the devices were running at completely different power levels. So we straight up asked AMD to provide us with their testing conditions. And they did. In their testing, the MacBook Pro with the M4 14-core chip was configured to run between 48 and 50.
So that already is weird because there is no real way to configure it yourself unless they somehow hack the BIOS. Now, I can see maybe they mean that the actual power consumption was just at its peak, 48 to 50 watts. However, to anybody who has ever like actually run a Cinebench test, you know that it never stays only between 2 watts. So I'm very much assuming they just took whatever the absolute peak value was for the CPU power consumption of the M4 Pro. Let me actually look here. And it's not like it's unheard of for the 10 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores together to utilize up to 50 watts. That's just not really the power level that Apple likes to hold steady on the Pro chips. Maybe more on the Max chips, but yeah, look at that power consumption. So under full multi-core load, the M4 Pro can consume up to 46 watts, settling at around 40 watts during the further course. So at its peaks, it consumes 60% more. This is probably a comparison to something else, maybe to like the regular M4, I don't know. But yeah, it reaching 46, 48, maybe 50 watts at its peak, yes. But you can already see that if you're doing a more detailed breakdown, you'll find that it doesn't actually like to consume that peak power. And that means that the vast majority of the score comes from using like 40 watts on average, right? So it's not like you can, like, let's say it had spiked for 1 millisecond to even something crazy like 80 watts because of a bug or something like that. It's not like you can really use that data. That being said, yes, of course, 46, 50 watts is still somewhat closer to 40 watts. But it's just a very different way to measure like power consumption, in my opinion, than when they give us like a rough TDP estimate.
50 watts, while the Ryzen AI Max Plus 395 CPU TDP was 55.
TDP is not the same as max power consumption. That is simply not true. I mean, AMD themselves says that the configurable TDP of the Ryzen AI Max Plus 395 is between 55 watts, or I believe they said 54 watts or something like that, up to 120 watts. And yes, I know that has to account for combined CPU and GPU usage, but just like thinking logically, right? What is the 16-core chip called without 3D cache? Ryzen 9 9950X. No, without the 3D part. Power consumption. Was that one of the last reviews that an Antec did? That's actually quite cool. 9950X, you can see at its peak consuming 200 watts. the 9900X consuming 12 cores. Now this is with higher clock speeds than what you'll find on the basically the laptop implementation of this, but this is essentially the 9950X. So let's even say that the power drops by half by reducing the peak clock speed by 10%, right? From 5.7 gigahertz to 5.1 or something like that. It should be in like this range rather than somehow jumping down to like the 50-watt range. That just doesn't make sense. And what was the power consumption of the was it the 7945 HX? That's the one without the 3D power consumption. So that was a 16-core Zen 4 chip. And yeah, that one can consume up to 80 to 100 watts. And Zen 5, when matching the clock speeds of Zen 4, is in this very similar range. So if you believe that this chip for some reason was limited to 55 watts, yeah, like I have a bridge to sell you. I'm sorry.
Watts. And that means AMD has taken some huge steps for performance per watt, and devices like the Flow Z13 capitalize on that through its power modes. Basically, it can run the processor core from about 30 watts to over 42 watts while still reserving a significant power budget.
Yeah, but that's combined CPU and GPU workflows. This is, yeah, it's natural. Like this is not the wattage that you'll get when in fact, even like most like super high-end gaming CPUs, when put into a laptop where they have to share TDP with a GPU, or they have to share power consumption with the GPU, even if they aren't on one die, that still leaves a lot of room. Like they still consume like similar amounts of power, just because a laptop cannot really handle that much higher power consumption usually.
Graphics, if it's needed. Of course, there's going to be other laptops.
Also, you would probably always try to target a game to be GPU limited roughly on a laptop rather than CPU limited. Having a game run at 240 hertz on a laptop is always like a little bit questionable to me. I mean, you can do it, and there are screens that allow it, but yeah, 60, 90, maybe even 120 hertz with a good CPU, that's very possible these days without consuming too much power. And still leaving like 60, 70, 80, maybe even 100 watts to the GPU. Hell, like with some of the upcoming 5090 mobile stuff, you might see a GPU peak power consumption of like 170 watts. So yeah, it's nothing too crazy here.
When you dive a bit further into things, what the ROG team has done
yeah, but this is a tablet. This will not run all those tests at the highest possible level.
Pretty impressive.
Maybe the single core tests.
When combined, the CPU and the GPU can chug back up to 120 watts together. And that means there's huge amounts of thermal capacity crammed into a device that's thinner than most laptops that I've seen. To achieve this, they're using their second generation arc flow fans, which is a full-size vapor chamber system, and liquid metal on the APU. I've been using this thing for more than a week, and even though this is a pre-production device, it stayed cool to the touch, and it's also pretty quiet. I've also thrown a crazy amount of workload at it as well during that time, including DaVinci Resolve projects to a bunch of gaming, and honestly, I can't wait to tell you all about it in the full review, so stay tuned for that. We also had to do some sanity checks on our end as well, basically taking our own numbers and comparing it to the benchmarks that ASUS posted themselves on their early pre-production Z13.
Yeah, so they do claim like an efficiency gain over previous generations, obviously utilizing the more interesting like APU lineup. How much of that will be super true remains to be seen. Also, like CPU power with like these Cinebench R23 results for one, why even use Cinebench R23? Like by the time any like meaningful testing was happening for these chips, Cinebench 2024 was not only available but the norm. Cinebench 2024, for one, is built on the newer engine by Maxon. It is a more comprehensive test that is much more meaningful for today's more advanced workflows. Like it's a 3D rendering thing that actually like uses more RAM, is more complex and stuff like that. So whenever people just like include old benchmarks, like I see that sometimes with like Geekervan and stuff like that, well, they will just have Geekbench 5 show up and they will be like, you know what? That's because there's still some truths inside older benchmarks. And yeah, I guess there is, but like at that point, comparing scaling for brand new chips on benchmarks that are already outdated for a product that is new and so new that it hasn't even come out, that's a little bit weird to me. At that point, it's really meaningless data, especially since the new app, which by the way, like Maxon doesn't do a great job of really releasing regular fixes for Cinebench, so that it is compatible with the latest CPUs and GPUs. I mean, obviously it works, but it works just like with general API access. They rarely say, oh, we actually went through the code and we optimized it really for Zen 5 or whatever. That's usually always reserved for the next version. So Cinebench 2025 will be built in mind with like Zen 5 cores and everything. But Cinebench R23 definitely wasn't. So if maybe even Cinebench 2024 is imperfect, then Cinebench R23 is basically just garbage. And this is why I always why I did hold off for so long from making like that benchmark chart that I promised on this channel for a while. This is because it's always a question. Like if I include Cinebench 2024, people will ask, well, but in Cinebench 2023 it loses, and I'm like, yeah, but there are reasons why I include one and not the other, and it's not because Apple wins one versus the other. I still believe that, for example, Geekbench GPU test is pretty worthless for a gaming assessment. Maybe it does like relatively well reflect like raw GPU compute. I couldn't tell you. But when it comes to like gaming, it definitely, like, as much as I might be in the camp of saying, you know what, I actually think the 18 Pro overall is a better gaming chip than the 8 Elite. I mean, the 8 Elite does allow for more power consumption, and by utilizing a larger GPU in general on the same node, it technically can give you some extra stuff, especially if you get one of the Snapdragon 8 Elites with like 10,700 mega transfers per second LPDDR5X. The iPhone is currently limited to 7,500 mega transfers per second memory. Yes, I fully understand that it will beat out the iPhone, but at much, much higher power consumption. And when it comes to stuff like this, I'm like, well, at least like some benchmarks are real life, right? Like comparing real games. Some benchmarks, they might be very specific to like a vision of compute that might not have anything to do with gaming, for example, like Geekbench 6. But then when I'm looking at Cinebench, for one, using Cinebench as a CPU test is already weird, because basically anyone working with 3D files will want to put that workload on the GPU rather than the CPU. But then testing the CPU for like a brand new chip on an old version of Cinebench, that to me is just weird.
It's because they're showing us how it scales.
And again, like you can see here, CPU power, I would be much more interested in seeing how this scales with GPU. Wait, is that the same test? No, it's not. What? It's times by gram. You couldn't run Cinebench. I'll just shut up. It's just so stupid.
Power. So let's do a bit of comparisons on the CPU performance side against systems we've had here, and right away you can see a trend developing. Basically, because it has more processing threads, it can run circles around the HX370 while also hanging pretty tight with the M4 Pro 14 core. In order to actually beat it, well, you'll need to look towards the gaming laptop side with the Legion 7i running its 14.
Yeah, again, so this is why I complained so much about the usage of Cinebench R23. That's because I knew that that would be the comparison that is being made here. Now, if we actually look, what is it called? CPU Monkey or something like that? For Pro CPU Monkey, or I guess Notebook Check would also have done it. That's the German website. Can you give me English, please? So Cinebench 2024 single core score. So this already, by the way, shows a huge difference to Cinebench 2023. Hopefully it shows Cinebench 2023 still on the website. Wait, what? Can I not show that directly on the website? So Cinebench R23 single score. That's M3. So you can see that in single core, in Cinebench 2023, R23, right? Even the fully powered M4 Max and M4 Pros, granted they have the same single core performance of 4.5 gigahertz, you'll see they lag behind like the Core Ultra 7 265K, the 3900 KS, right? But they are not bad, right? At worst, they're like kind of like 5-ish% down, right? But then as we looked at the Cinebench 2024 single core results, right? This is where it's like 20% ahead of those competitors, like the 4900 KS here and the 265K in KF, right? So it goes from 5% slower to like 20% faster. And that's because Cinebench R23 has the most basic ass implementation of support for ARM CPUs. And it's garbage at utilizing not just the Apple Silicon chips, but also, for example, the Snapdragon X Elite, right? Snapdragon X Elite also sees a noticeable uplift in these tests. In fact, when I look at it, right, it's 139. It matches here the performance levels of something crazy like the 9950X, the 285K, the 4900 KS. And when we look at the same results in Cinebench 2020 R23 again, we'll have to go hunting a little bit for where the X Elite actually is. I cannot have missed it already. Is it really that far behind? Or did they not test it on R23 maybe? Is that? Oh, no, really? That will just be, I guess I could type in Snapdragon. Yeah, there is no Snapdragon chips here. Oh, damn. Let me actually look that up. Snapdragon X Elite, Cinebench R23. Notebook check. You see some even test like Cinebench R15 and R20 still. This is so stupid. But yeah, when you look here at this is the R23 multi-core score. Where's the single core score? Here, it's 1127. It's like literally half of the performance of the M4 in such a test. It's like Cinebench R23 is just not built for ARM chips. So that's what I'm trying to tell you. So Apple has like a 25% uplift from basically in how it compares to the other chips that's in single core. Let's look at the multi-core score actually here. So Cinebench and multi-core, we'll look at the 14, that's 23,000. And when you actually see what that compares to, 23,000. That compares to like a 13600K, the 8-core 9700X or 9800X 3D. Okay, so let's see what that means in Cinebench 2024 multi-core score. First, I forgot the result. 1742. So let's look at 1742, and you'll see now it's actually comparable literally to chips with 50% more cores. So previously we compare it to like the 9700X, 9800X 3D, right? Now it's comparable to the 9900X, 9900X 3D. Those are 12 core parts, 12 core desktop parts, rather than parts with much higher power consumption than the 9800X 3D, than the 9700X. Suddenly it's not even too far off from like the desktop parts like the 265K, which consume way more power, right? Even sits above something like the laptop 7945HX. That's the chip I already pointed out as being basically a 16-core version of Zen 4, similar to how this will be a 16-core version of Zen 5. So yeah, absolutely believe me when I say like using Cinebench R23 here is very unfair, and not because Cinebench R23, not because Cinebench 2024 was like an Apple bench, right? It's like a bought benchmark to make Apple look good. No, Cinebench R23 just sucked for utilizing ARM-based chips. So, and Cinebench 2024 isn't even perfect at it. So, who knows? By Cinebench 2025, maybe Apple can get another 5 points or so over the competition here. But yeah, just trying to point out that whenever people react this seriously to these results, I always take them with a grain of salt.
14900HX at a crazy 100 watts in extreme mode. And remember, the flow numbers are based on ASUS's own testing with very early firmware. GPU performance is a bit harder to nail down since drivers play such a heavy role, but
yeah, and this is already, by the way, where we don't have Mac included here in the GPU test, which I guess kind of makes sense. I mean, I still would have loved to see actual GPU comparisons to something like the M4 Max, but like, and there are games that run on Mac and on Windows, and there are 3D rendering software apps that run on Mac and Windows, and there are video editing apps that run on Mac and Windows. So yeah, like choosing 3D Mark Time Spy probably means, by the way, that it performs the best in 3D Mark Time Spy, like out of all potential tests. You can see it pretty much matches the performance of the 4070 with very similar power consumption, which I guess for an RDNA 3.5 GPU, it's not too disappointing to, on the same note, to match the RTX 40 series. But it's also not going to be the greatest start when we are just about to get the RTX 5000 series into laptops. So this will probably make it more comparable to a 50, well, yeah, to a mobile 5060 Ti, or maybe even just a 5060, depending on how generous NVIDIA is going to be with those laptop GPUs.
Based on what Asus is showing at 40 watts and 70 watts, the numbers sit somewhere between an RTX 4060 and RTX 4070.
And yeah, by the way, you can see that it matches the efficiency range roughly of the 4000 series. I mean, technically it consumes a tiny bit less power for like a tiny bit more performance, so maybe the efficiency gain here is like 10% overall, but it's not mind-blowing. From an APU, usually I would love to see the benefits of maybe the CPU utilization at that point. The CPU power consumption will be way lower than it would be when it comes to running a dedicated GPU. But then you also have the advantages that at least if you have a dedicated GPU, you can cool all of it separately. You can divide like the heat load between like left and right, basically. So usually I would want to see a far bigger efficiency gain to actually justify switching to an APU-like design. That's what we have seen with Apple Silicon. This is more catch-up than a monumental leap forward. Also, where are other AMD GPUs? I guess they were too trash or too irrelevant to be compared. By the way, guys, we've been streaming for about 1.5 hours. We're quickly coming to the end. So please subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet done so. Like the video, share it out to anybody who you think might enjoy it. Comment. I love interacting with a lively live chat. Love getting your opinions. Love getting your agreements or your disagreements. It also helps very much with the algorithm. You can leave a super chat or a super sticker with a small direct donation right here. You can become a channel member on YouTube, or you can become a supporter over on Patreon. However you choose to support us here, me, to be more precise, it's all very welcome. Thank you guys for your support.
It's also way above any integrated graphics we've ever tested. And I know...
I mean, that's not true. You literally tested M4 Pro and M4 Max here on this channel. Like, why? Whenever we are using very specific words, right? Oh, it's like the best APU, or it has the best integrated GPU, right? We don't associate those words with like Apple. Usually with Apple, we use more terms like SoC, and we just call it the GPU of the M4 Max rather than the integrated GPU. But technically, those terms are all kind of interchangeable when we are talking about all systems in a package and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a bit misleading.
This might look like we're hyping this thing up, but it's just impossible not to get at least a bit excited about M4 competing CPU performance with RTX 4060 gaming horse.
And again, we have where is it? I believe MaxTech has actually, I have no idea where they got this from. Maybe they actually took it. Wake up Apple, this is bad. Oh yeah, this is such a weird video, by the way. So they made a similar comparisons here to the Ryzen AI Max Plus 395. Again, glorious Windows. Can I please, please don't tell me
370, and that was
okay. Thank God this is not the auto-translated German version. I have no idea why this shit keeps happening. All my account settings are in English, but it still like translates YouTube videos to German whenever available. So,
so in terms of performance,
Geekbench multi-core here. Like for one, where are the M4 results?
I was comparing it to the M4, and we were kind of hoping they would eventually catch up. But just like that, CES 2025, they come out with this banger chip, AI Max Plus 395, and the performance is absolutely insane. And same for the actual graphics. We're looking at about 100,000 OpenCL score, which means...
So this is something I already don't get. They say it's 100,000. I mean, it clearly shows 80,000. My only speculation that could make sense here is maybe they used the 32-core version and then just added 25% more power, which is not really how this test works. It does depend a little bit on bandwidth. So if the bandwidth is the same, we likely wouldn't see like linear uplifts between like 32 and 40 compute units. Or it could be that AMD told them, and this is actually a 395, that it's 80,000 for now, but you know what? We actually are targeting like around 100,000 in this test. And again, this is OpenCL. It's very hard to compare these results. I always say, even if you want to compare these, those are more like compute results. They have very little to do with gaming. So yeah, not the greatest test.
Means
for
it's
GPUs.
competitive with the M4 Pro. I think it's actually the 16-core graphics. There's also the 20-core M4 Pro that's a little bit faster, but that is mind-blowing in terms of having that much graphics performance. And
yeah, and by the way, you could see from that test, this would very much, now granted, this does utilize metal, so maybe it's just a lot better than even OpenCL is on an AMD GPU. But you could see that bandwidth here is actually king, because you could get 25% more compute units here, but you get 12%, actually a little bit less, uplift in raw compute power. So the fact that bandwidth did not scale up from that test, because those are all around 270 gigabits per second, whether you take the 16-core version or the 20-core version, you already see that it hits some memory-related bottlenecks. So my assumption here is that given that the Ryzen AI Plus 395 doesn't even match this bandwidth, much less that of the M4 Max, we will likely see it really in some tests for some reason losing against an SoC with half as many GPU cores.
Core M4 Pro that's a little bit faster, but that is mind-blowing in terms of having that much graphics performance and CPU performance built into an APU chip, just like Apple's silicon. I remember years ago, we were talking about Apple silicon making the change and hoping that other brands would follow. Here we are at CES 2025, and AMD came out with this amazing update. I just can't
Well,
imagine.
to be honest, to attack MaxTech just a little bit, it's not like I don't dislike those guys, but their predictions have mostly been based that we would see ARM SoCs. And actually, the company that seemingly is pushing even harder than Qualcomm for ARM SoCs in the Windows space seemingly is NVIDIA. So this might not be the chip that actually verifies their predictions, but maybe NVIDIA will at some point this year.
Imagine over the next couple of years, Apple is going to have some competition from AMD. Of course, we also have the NVIDIA RTX 5090. Years is laptop right here. Years. Here we are, silicon metal, Apple's and CPU.
Oh yeah, this is the CPU test, by the way. So this is Geekbench, of course, so don't try to line it up with the R23 results. So the single core result seems to be a solid 25% behind what Apple is delivering on the M4 Pro and M4 Max, which are, of course, chips that can reach all the way up to 3950 or 4000 in single core. In multi-core score, this is where I actually would have to look up some stuff again. So did I close the? No. So Geekbench, let me look at Mac benchmarks. And Geekbench is actually made to be fully comparable between systems. So it adjusts basically for the OS and everything as much as it can. So multi-core results, the M4 Max, 25,000 here. So that would be a solid 25% ahead of the result that we are seeing here. That, of course, with 12 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores rather than 16 full Zen 5 desktop class cores, but also, of course, with the advantage of N3E versus N4. So it's not bad. I would love to see the power consumption. Technically, this should consume way more power. No E-cores in that equation. x86 versus ARM, 4 nanometer versus 3 nanometer. But we'll have to wait and see what exactly plays out here. And when we look at the M4 Pro, which is what they're using here all the time, Where is it? That's the M3 Pro. Wait, the M4 Pro was somewhere around here. Just I remember that, but for some reason it's just not in the official chart. Yeah, and then beyond that, they keep talking about the RTX 5000 series, which again we have covered already here. The main benefit for laptops that I haven't yet mentioned too much is the fact that the RTX 4090 mobile supports 24 gigs of RAM on a 256-bit bus. So that's of course paired with GDDR7 memory. So that will be a nice bandwidth advantage over Apple in that mobile desktop space. So this is why I kept bringing up bandwidth so much, because let me actually look here. RTX 5000 mobile specs. I'm actually not sure if they have given the exact compute count. 16 gigabytes of memory is wrong, so I have no idea. Like, what part? That's TU104. That doesn't even make sense. Or does it? No, not for the 24 gig card. That's Quadro. It's RTX 5000 mobile Ada? Really? RTX 5000 mobile. Oh, let me just look at news. What this is so stupid branding. I'll just go 5090 mobile. Is it really not like just on their website? NVIDIA. $5090 laptop. There's 24 gigabytes of GDDR7, 377 square millimeter die size. This is over 256-bit bus. If it's the same memory speed as on the... It's probably clocked a little bit lower, I would probably bet, than on the RTX 5080, which is pretty much the same die here. And that one uses 2 gigabyte GDDR7 module, so that's why the RTX 5080 has only 16 gigabytes of RAM, while the 5090 mobile has 24 gigabytes. Those leaks are actually correct in the end, but does it say how much bandwidth it has? No. But like at least the RTX 5080 desktop has like around 900 gigabits per second. That's slightly faster clocked memory than even on the 5090 desktop. So maybe if that one is tasked more clocked more similarly to the 5090 desktop rather than the 5080 desktop, maybe it's around 800 gigabits per second. So definitely a nice advantage over the 540 gigabits per second that Apple has for the entire SoC, while this is just for the GPU portion. So definitely going to have some advantages here over the M4 Max. Maybe there's like bandwidth officially. So mobile specs, is that 24 gigabytes? Oh yeah, that seems to be the... No, that's not true. The 5090 mobile is not on a 384-bit bus. Where is this bullshit data coming from? Is this like AI auto-generated? Yeah, bandwidth 1.22 terabytes per second. Yeah, it's certainly faster than the 5080 mobile. This is bullshit. Jesus, why are you doing this? Okay, so that spec just hasn't come out yet. If we just look at the 5080, at the 5090 desktop, hopefully those are actually correct. Yes, 512-bit bus, 28 gigabits per second memory, resulting in 1.7, 1.8 terabits per second of overall bandwidth. And if we look here at the 5080, which is basically half the 5090, you will find that it has a 256-bit bus with slightly higher clocked memory, which results in it having 960 gigabits per second, which of course means that the RTX 5090 Mobile, which is based on that die, using a higher density memory so that they can have 24 gigabytes of RAM rather than 16, should come in somewhere around this. The other configurations, like the theoretical performance, those will greatly depend on the clock speeds. Those will greatly depend on the speed on the cooling capacity of a laptop. So yeah, those details are actually hard to nail down in a laptop. They will vary from model to model, from implementation to implementation, from manufacturer to manufacturer. But yeah, this is just the rest of the CES coverage that I wanted to do. I promised you I would go a little bit more in depth on the mobile parts, but you can see the data on the mobile parts is still woefully slim. I did provide you now with more data on AMD's large APUs, and how that they might or might not be now compatible with the M4 family of chips. And of course, we've covered a lot of Apple news and rumors today, thanks to Bloomberg's Mark Gurman. So we've been streaming for almost 2 hours. Thank you to anyone who joined. Last shout out to do all the YouTube jazz, as we call it around here. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it out with anybody who you think might enjoy it. Comment afterwards, that helps with the algorithm. Whenever you catch me live, you can leave a super chat or super sticker to support me here directly. You can become a channel member right here on YouTube, or support you over on Patreon. However you want to support this channel is all very much appreciated. Help us grow the community, help us make these streams even more lively and more interactive. And as always, let me know what you would like to see me cover next. Thank you guys so much. This is Mark Tech, tuning out.